Hello, Professor.
Hello, Shadi. It's a pleasure to be with you.
How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm doing very well here in Miami.
Okay, how was you just finished class? How was class?
Class was great. Class was great. Always happy to be on the mat to spend time with my students. And now here in our Valente Brothers Library, also a place that I like to spend a lot of time in, studying the history of our beautiful art.
Yeah, that's arguably the best thing you can possibly do. I'm very happy and honored for you to take the time and be here with me. I know I have a lot of things to ask from you, someone who's been training for decades, especially when it comes to self-defense in the arts. I know there's a lot of beautiful aspects that we like to do that are not reflective of reality, but at the same time, there is a lot of self-defense. It's not just sparring, there's a lot of techniques. So for example, when we say Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, when we say BJJ, when we say kata, when we say judo, it's all creates this like a big fog. And is it, when we say Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, is it the same as BJJ? Because when Royce, took off his belt and wore the blue belt, just like you, Grandmaster Elio Gracie, what was he trying to state, and what is Gracie Jiu-Jitsu? Like, that's the whole issue. Is it just self-defense, or is there like just a different approach from like the big image of BJJ in general?
So I don't like to and great question, thank you. I think Royce was trying to pay tribute to his father. He didn't feel comfortable getting promoted by anyone else. And so that's why he started wearing the Navy belt like his father did in the 50s, and his uncle, the Gracie brothers, Carlos and Hélio Gracie. That's the same reason why we did it. But I think these terms are very broad. When you say Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, when you say Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, people practice these arts, these methodologies in different ways. For example, Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. Gracie is a family name. And there are many, many Gracies involved in Jiu-Jitsu, and they all practice it a little bit differently. And so it's difficult to pinpoint a style, a universal style called Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, a uniform practice of Jiu-Jitsu that the entire Gracie family engages in. Same thing in the Brazilian community, in the community of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And when you're talking about such a long history, since the time Maeda was teaching in Brazil in the beginning of the 20th century until now, we're talking almost 100 years. The practice went through a lot of transformations. So firstly, I think that all of us, including judo, Olympic judo, pre-federation jiu-jitsu in Brazil, Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, BJJ, Kodokan judo, all these are expressions of the same thing, of the art of the Japanese samurai warriors that they called jiu-jitsu. And then with the Meiji Restoration, Jigoro Kano had such an amazing role in organizing a methodology for the modern era. And then this art traveled to the Western world through some amazing teachers, some from the Kodokan, like Mitsuyo Maeda, others not directly from the Kodokan, influenced by the Kodokan. At that time, they all knew each other's methods, and they started teaching in England, around Europe, in the United States, and around the world, and eventually in Brazil. And those Japanese pioneers adapted the art for the Western culture and for the Western self-defense practices. And so that's what arrived in Brazil. That's what Carlos Gracie and his brothers learned in Belém do Pará and started teaching in Rio. And they continued to go through transformations. Eventually, both in Japan and in Brazil, it became more focused on sport, both Olympic judo and BJJ. It happened in Japan a little bit before, and then a little bit later in Brazil. And the practice changed and became more focused on sport than on self-defense. But it's important that we define what is sport, what is self-defense, how does sport help in self-defense, where does it lack when it comes to self-defense. All these are important questions that we must discuss. But I think that The jujitsu that I learned from Grandmaster Helio Gracie was a jujitsu focused on real combat, on self-defense. And this jujitsu includes 5 elements, right? It includes striking techniques, atemiwaza. So you learn how to strike with your hands, with your legs, with your knees, with your elbows, kicks, punches. All of this is part of jujitsu in our mind. You have nagewaza, the throwing techniques, right? You have katamewaza or newaza, which is the ground grappling techniques. You have something that is missing in the sportive practice, which is defending surprise attacks. Because in a real fight, there's no referee to say, are you ready? Are you ready? Let's get it on. It usually goes from an argument to a sudden attack. It could be a slap, it could be a punch, it could be a kick. And so defense is against surprise attacks. That's the 4th one. And the 5th one is the philosophy. The philosophy of jiu-jitsu, which is so important. And so we learn jiu-jitsu as a complete system of self-defense. If you look at what the Japanese were talking about when they first arrived in the Western world, they were talking about jiu-jitsu as a complete system of self-defense. And when I say jiu-jitsu, at that time, the words jiu-jitsu and judo were used interchangeably. So we're talking about the same thing. I think this discussion, is it judo, is it jiu-jitsu, is a little bit childish in a way. Forgive that if that word is offensive to some, but I think it's a little bit childish because it's the same thing. Judo and jiu-jitsu were treated in the same way. You know that Japanese journals in Brazil, Japanese newspapers, in the 1930s, they would have one page in Portuguese and then the page next to it in Japanese for the Japanese community. And when they talked about jiu-jitsu, when they talked about even the Gracies, when they wrote it in Portuguese, they would use the word jiu-jitsu. The direct translation on the other page, they would use the word in Japanese, judo. So to them, it's like in Japan, we use the term judo. In Brazil, we use the term jiu-jitsu, but it was the same thing. The separation between judo and jiu-jitsu only happened much later. Even the Gracies, they felt that they were part of the same community as the ones who were teaching judo in Brazil. So it's important to understand, obviously, Olympic judo and Brazilian jiu-jitsu now are very different because of the rule set, but they are expression of the same original art. Expressions.
All right. You're right. Especially
and once again, feel free to disagree with me. I know you're very knowledgeable in the subject, and I love a good, healthy discussion. I think we can always disagree without becoming disagreeable. So please feel free to challenge me on anything that I'm saying.
No, the thing with being interchangeable, that's very correct. Because they've been saying for centuries, jujutsu. When he first opened up his school, wasn't the big Kodokan building that we have today. It was actually a total of 12 mats. It was a room. It had 12 mats, and they were still using like the old interchangeable words like koryu, for example, kanoryu. Even Oda, when he was going down on the ground and doing nothing but ground, so he can win the the Kosen tournaments, they called it Tsunetane Ryu. So, for example, when you say Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, that's a kind of saying the school of Gracie or Gracie Ryu.
Correct.
And they've been saying for centuries Jiu-Jitsu, so it must have traveled. Jiu-Jitsu, saying Do, it simply means that you incorporate this philosophy in and outside of the mats. That's all that it is. So no, that's really fine. People, I think, really need to understand that the difference saying Jiu-Jitsu and saying Judo, and really understanding that there's many dimensions to an art. It's not just techniques, or we are similar in this technique and it ends there. There is the culture, as Robert Drysdale kept on saying, the cultural aspect. Very different. We live in Brazil, it's different than in Japan, and that's it. But also now I need to ask, like, when I talk about self-defense, especially when I show drills, exercises, a lot of people, they say always the same thing. This is dumb, this is stupid, you're gonna get killed if you do these exercises. but at the same time, I see some photos or videos from your school. You're doing some self-defense exercises, and also I have the X and Gracie, the videos of self-defense. They're a little bit like, and people say this is, it doesn't work. So how do you feel about those, self-defense exercises or drills, or creating a street scenario? Maybe you're pushed on the wall, someone got you in a headlock, and you learn what to do. Like, how do you feel about those?
Yes, let me just say something before I answer your question, something to touch upon something you said, which I think is very important, that do only means the way, the philosophy with which the art is practiced. And even Jigoro Kano sensei, he was asked, how come you don't use a new term? Because for us, Westerners, non-Japanese, when we hear the words judo and jujitsu, they sound very different. But for a Japanese person, jujitsu and judo, it's like the gentle way and the gentle art. For them, it's the same. It's only the second character is different. The first character is the same. So they asked him, why don't you choose a completely new word? He said, because I don't think it would be fair, because I don't feel like I'm inventing a new martial art. I'm just developing a methodology for the instruction, organizing it, creating a culture for it that's compatible with modern sciences and with the modern times. So that's the first point. With respect to the practice of self-defense, in fact, when we post videos online, what I get most is not that it doesn't work. What I get most is that is judo. That's what people say all the time. That is just pure judo. Because the stand-up self-defense techniques against surprise attacks, they involve a lot of throws. Because fights start standing up, they don't start on the ground. And so striking and throwing are extremely important for self-defense. And the thing is this, imagine someone who never trains on the ground recording a video on ground grappling for the internet. Or someone who never trains throwing techniques, recording a video for the internet and posting it. It's going to look very sloppy. What I feel is that because of the prevalence of the sport, most people are not constantly practicing these stand-up techniques against surprise attacks. So many times when they record videos, it looks very unrealistic. It looks static. Even in the history of jiu-jitsu in Japan, you will find kata forms, people practicing static repetition of the movements in a prearranged format. And there's a place for that in learning technique. But if you're going to be able to use those techniques in real combat, you need to practice them in a dynamic way. And the reason why many people don't respect the techniques of self-defense is because they are shown in a very unrealistic and static manner. Here, since we don't train the sportive aspect of jiu-jitsu, and let me explain what I mean by that, because when I say that, people think that that means that we don't do randori, that we don't spar. Randori is a very important aspect of our training. I think I heard you say this one time, and I think you were absolutely right when you said that self-defense cannot be practiced realistically without randori. I agree with that wholeheartedly. And randori is an important part of the training. But I also believe that if you only do randori, then it starts taking you in a direction where you're not developing certain reactions, certain instincts that might get you in trouble in a real fight. For example, if somebody walks to you and punches you in the face, you might not be ready for that because you're not addressing those scenarios on a regular basis.
Like what happened recently?
I don't like to judge specific situations, but we can talk in general about the idea of being able to defend yourself against a sucker punch or against a slap, right? And developing and how being a champion and practicing a sport will not give you those instincts. if you're not creating scenarios in your training of someone pushing you, shoving you, getting in your face, trying to punch you, if you're not constantly, and also weapons, the guy might pull a knife. So are you constantly drilling these scenarios? And I don't talk about a very static kata way of practicing. And I'm not saying that that way is not good. There's a place for that. But if you're not also practicing the surprise element, I'm standing in front of you, I push you, I'm in your face, and you don't know what I'm going to do, if I'm going to throw a punch, if I'm going to push you, if I'm going to pull a knife that is hidden inside my shirt, and having you practice the reactions against these situations. If you're not constantly doing that, then you're not going to be a black belt, if I can put it this way, in that aspect of jiu-jitsu. If you only practice this once in a while, you're going to be a white belt. Some people say, oh no, the self-defense is great for people who are non-athletes and who cannot spar. So just teach them that because they're older, or for children, or for women who are not able to spar. I completely disagree with that. I think that even a great athlete could get punched in the face if he doesn't have the right reflexes and the right training.